In talking about connecting a continent, I was struck by the fact that, of course, world affairs are no longer, if they ever were meaningfully, about nation states autonomously pursuing their national interests. Today, it's very much more a world of interdependence, of regional, sub-regional, and transnational cooperation across boundaries. And Asia, in many ways, sticks out as a sore thumb for having made the least progress in connecting with each other across the continental divides. Certainly, South Asia has been described by the World Bank as the world's least integrated region, or sub-region if you wish. Just 5% of South Asia's trade is within the SAARC region, and a region with 22% of the world's population, as a result perhaps, produces only 6% of its GDP. Further trade integration within South Asian economies could easily yield a couple of $1 billion to consumers, but political and logistical obstacles have prevented that. It's very clear that strong political ties can lead to stronger economic ties, as well as vice versa. And with the current global economic slowdown, it's all the more important to look to Asia to be the engine for economic development and growth, which will need, of course, more mutual support and respect. I mean, it's striking that if you look at just India's exports, for example, 13.4% of all our exports go to the US, and just 4.2% go to China. So very clearly, we are far from acting east, as our Prime Minister has often said it. But India actually is an interesting perspective from which to look at Asian connections, because you could essentially look at 4 significant Asian sub-regions: West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast and East Asia. And if you were to look at the continent in that way, and from an Indian perspective, and that's where I sit as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Indian Parliament, West Asia, our connections are almost entirely centered around 2 things: labor, Indian migrant labor in the Gulf countries in particular is close to 6 million people now, and oil. It's a vital source of oil and gas for India. Otherwise, regular connectivity is much more modest. Central Asia, the potential is huge, but connectivity is obviously limited thanks to the perhaps insuperable barrier of hostility with Pakistan, which lies between us and Central Asia, as well as, of course, the unfulfilled potential of Afghanistan, given its own enormous civil traumas. That leaves us with South Asia itself, which I have described to you, and East and Southeast Asia. And I'll take a couple of minutes to talk about the latter, because our Look East policy was enunciated in the early 90s. It was not merely a matter of external policy, but a strategic shift in India's vision of the world and of India's place in the evolving global economy. And it was about reaching out to civilizational neighbors in the region and availing of the economic opportunities presented by these countries. And the realization that greater economic integration with Southeast and East Asia was, of course, the key to all of this. These are countries with which trade links had flourished millennia ago, and that would make them natural trading partners. But politics and the Cold War and various divisions through the 50s and 60s had prevented this from becoming a reality for quite some time. Today, the launch of the Look East policy in the early 90s has now been intensified with the announcement of an Act East policy by the present government during the India-ASEAN summit in November 2014. And this has meant that there's a renewed emphasis on connectivity, at least eastward, whereas, as I mentioned earlier, with West Asia, some of the connections need to be built upon, and that too appears to be beginning to be taken very seriously. The India-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement on goods, adopted in August 2009, in the face, by the way, of critical domestic opposition from farmers in India, is perhaps the most striking evidence of the strategic priority afforded by the Indian government of the day to commercial relations with East Asia and Southeast Asia. And then there are, of course, a slew of bilateral agreements signed with individual countries, FTAs and comprehensive economic agreements with a lot of East Asian, Southeast Asian countries. Japan has become a significant player in this as well, with its cumulative FDI in India accounting for almost $16 billion from 2000 to 2015. At the same time, there is no question that it's not enough to look at these individual economic developments. They are undergirded by the absence of political problems, but and the end of the extraneous factors, shall we say, that prevented better relations with ASEAN. But at the same time, the strategic partnership with ASEAN still has to be mirrored in a number of concrete and positive developments that would involve the boosting of trade, the deepening of investments, the establishment of a genuine free trade area, and indeed much, much more tourism than we actually see today. It's striking that in the last couple of years we've seen a decrease in total trade between ASEAN and India, and that worries me because obviously the trend was expected to be steadily in the other direction. Part of the lessons we in India need to learn is that it's all very well for us to look east and act east, but that needs to be reciprocated from East Asia and Southeast Asia by those countries looking and acting west towards India as well. And that again is a progress that we need to make. There are other interesting examples of sub-regional cooperation. There's the Indian Ocean Rim Association, EORA. There's BIMSTEC, which ties together a number of countries of both South and Southeast Asia, and the Mekong-Ganga Cooperation Organization. But I think it would be disingenuous to imply that any of these have come close to fulfilling their huge potential, and they certainly lag behind comparable organizations in other parts of the world, in Latin America and Europe particularly. I'll end by simply saying that we in Asia are all countries that are very proud of our sovereignty. We have tended to celebrate with great fierceness our independence days. But it's time we across Asia realized, it seems to me, that every other day in the calendar right across Asia is really an interdependence day. Thank you very much.